So today we're going to be looking at again international trade and how does trade happen across borders and how can we actually become better off with trade as opposed to not having any trade at all. So what gains from trade are possible to see? So with this, we'll start out looking at our absolute comparative advantage. We kind of introduced these a long time ago, but just kind of reintroduce them, look at what they mean, and look at the whole trade process. That is, how can we trade and what does the whole process really look like? Then from there, we'll see how we go and see how far we get. So when we think about two countries, uh, we have these two types of advantage called absolute and comparative, and we talked about them before. Last time we referenced them, we used an example of myself and a professional NBA player doing a 3-point shootout and a 100-meter dash. Right, and that's kind of the example that I referenced previously in the class, but today we'll look at it from a more of a national angle rather than an individual angle. So the first thing we have is called absolute advantage. And what absolute advantage tells us is that a country can produce a good using fewer resources than another country. So in essence, what this means is that one country is better at producing this good than another. And the other type we have is called comparative advantage. And this is referring to if a country can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost in terms of the other goods. So you could have a case where one country is better than the other at both. That is, one country has the absolute advantage in both, but they will only have the comparative advantage in one because there's going to be a trade-off, and one country is going to have a better trade-off in terms of these two goods. So to kind of show this off, I'm kind of just going straight into an example, and we'll see where we go. So I'm going to come out to the side. That way I'm not pulling stuff out of thin air. But suppose that we have this case, and we have two countries. We have Saudi Arabia and the United States. And then in these two countries, we have oil and corn. And first we're going to be looking at is, in this first chart, we're going to look at how many hours does it take to produce 1 unit of each. So for oil, hours per barrel. For corn, we'll look at hours per bushel. So how many labor hours does it take for each country to produce these goods? And this is something, all of this so far that we're doing would be given. So in this case, we're going to say that Saudi Arabia can produce a barrel of oil in 1 hour, while Saudi Arabia can produce 1 bushel of corn in 4 hours. Then we'll say that in the U.S. we can produce it takes 2 hours to produce 1 barrel of oil, and it takes the U.S. 1 hour to produce a unit of corn. So again, what this is saying is how long does it take to produce 1 unit? And with this, we're looking at how many resources do we have to give up. So when we think about our absolute advantage, we can think about this for each country. First, for oil, in this case, we see that Saudi Arabia can make oil with only 1 unit of labor, while the United States takes 2 hours. So so Saudi Arabia, in this case, will have that comparative advantage in the production of oil. But on the other side, if we think about our corn, it takes Saudi Arabia 4 hours to make 1 unit of corn, whereas in the U.S., we can make a corn in 1 hour. So when we think about corn, this is going to go to the United States. Again, absolute advantage, it's just, hopefully, it's super straightforward. Who can make the product using fewer resources? The other type of thing we have is our comparative advantage. And this one takes a little bit more, there's a little more to this one. So I will, after we do this, I'll show a little shortcut for comparative advantage. But at first, when we think about this, we want to first we'll look into oil. And for this, what we have to do is we have to consider what is the opportunity cost. So the question is, what is the opportunity cost to produce 1 unit of oil, or to produce 1 barrel of oil? And we have to find this for each country. So we'll see that in the US, if we want to say, well, how much do I have to give up to produce 1 unit of oil? I can say another way we can think about this, just to keep everything kind of in line with our fractions and everything, is how much corn do I give up to make 1 oil? That's another way to think about this. So if we think about the US, right, we can make either it takes us 2 hours to make an oil or 1 hour to make a corn. So if I think about how many corns can I make in the same time I can make 1 oil, I know that in 2 hours, the US can make either 1 oil or 2 corn. Right. So basically, all I'm saying is that since corn takes an hour, in 2 hours, I can make 2 bushels of corn. So the opportunity cost, and then we already have that as 1 oil. So for the US, the opportunity cost of oil is 1 corn, or is 2 corn. That is, we have to give up 2 corn to get 1 oil. However, on the other side, when we think about Saudi Arabia now, we're going to think of it the same way. But with Saudi Arabia, I'm going to think about it in 4 hours. And you'll see why in a moment. It's going to work out to give us the same. We'll see that in 4 hours, Saudi Arabia can make, let's just get this written out. In 4 hours, Saudi Arabia can make either 4 oils or 1 corn. Right? So in this case, what we're seeing is, well, how much corn does Saudi Arabia have to give up to get 1 oil? In this case, we can divide each of these by 4, and we get that they can produce 1 oil or a quarter a bushel of corn. So in Saudi Arabia, the opportunity cost of oil is 1/4 or 0.25 bushel of corn. So for the comparative advantage, we're interested who has lower opportunity cost. In this case, for the US, it's 2. For Saudi Arabia, it's 1/4. So for our comparative advantage in oil, Saudi Arabia will has that comparative advantage. Cool. And that's again because they can produce it at that lower opportunity cost. A little trick that we can do, so we have corn for the other side. If we want to, we can go through and recalculate everything, or we can take the reciprocals. So for corn in the US, we're going to take with the opportunity cost of oil is 2 corn. So this means the opportunity cost of a corn will be 1/2 an oil. And then for Saudi Arabia, the opportunity cost of corn will be 1/1/4, which is 4. So the opportunity cost of corn is 4 oil. So in this case, the US is up here. 1/2 is better than 4. So the US has the comparative advantage, in corn. And as we work through these, a couple a couple things that we'll see come up and a couple notes, I guess. The first thing is if a country has comparative advantage in one good, the comparative advantage in one good, then the other country has it in the other. So in this case, we first saw that Saudi Arabia had the comparative advantage in oil. I know that since they had the comparative advantage in oil, the U.S. would have it in corn, and that's just a matter of fractions. And the second thing we can note is that if our absolute advantages are different, that is, like in this case, right? And I'll come up to show what I mean by that. In this case, Saudi Arabia had the absolute advantage in oil, and United States had the absolute advantage in corn. So if the absolute advantages are different, then the comparative advantages will follow suit. So in addition to number one saying, hey, since I know Saudi Arabia has the comparative advantage in oil, I know that US has the comparative advantage in corn, I can then actually take this even a step up and say that, well, since Saudi Arabia has the absolute advantage in oil and the United States has the absolute advantage in corn, since this happened, or since we have these different absolute advantages, uh, I know that Saudi Arabia also has a comparative, and the United States, excuse me, I know Saudi Arabia has a comparative advantage in oil, and the U.S. has a comparative advantage in corn. So just a couple tricks that we see with this, and so on. Nice little introduction to comparative and absolute advantage. But then if we want to take this a step further, let's suppose that we have, suppose that each country has 100 labor hours. And I'm interested in saying, what goods could we produce if we each have 100 labor hours to work with, or 100 worker hours, whatever the case is. So, we're going to come in and I'm going to say, again, I have my countries, and I have Saudi Arabia and the United States. Then within each of these countries, this time, though, what I'm going to have is our oil production and our corn production. And if I have 100 hours to work with, and it takes Saudi Arabia 1 hour to make a barrel, this means that they are going to produce 100 barrels of oil. And same thing for the US. If I have 100 hours to work with and it takes 1 hour to produce a bushel of corn, I'm going to have 100 bushels of corn. For other cases, if it takes 2 hours to make a barrel of oil, I'll take my 100 hours, divide that by, so in the US oil, I have 100 hours and I have 2 hours per barrel. If I take 100 by 2, I'm going to get that the US can produce 50 units of oil, and same thing for Saudi corn. I have 100 hours to work with, and they can produce it takes 4 hours to produce 1 unit of corn. 100 divided by 4 gives them 25 corns. So this is going to be a production, and this is what we could produce. So as we look at this, we're going to say that Saudi Arabia can produce 100 oil or 25 corn, and the US can produce 50 oil or 100 corn. And we have other ways we can distribute that. So we can say, well, uh, right, we can have them each make some smaller number of each. So the US could also make 50 corn and 25 oil if they wanted to. And Saudi Arabia can do other combinations as well. Anything to be on that PPF. Um, and we kind of see where we end up going. And this is, again, what this part is showing is our production possibility frontier. So if we look at Saudi Arabia, I'm going to say the Saudi PPF. We'll say that we have oil and corn. And we say that Saudi Arabia can produce either 100 oil or 25 corn. Right. And they can produce anything on this production possibility frontier. And same thing with the US, their production possibility frontier. Again, we have oil and corn. Let's spell that correctly. There we go. So the US can produce either 50 oil or 100 corn. So we will denote that 50 or 100, and we will look something like that. So, and we can make any point on this curve. Whatever makes us happy, we can do. So what if we said, if we live in a world in what we call autarky, and what autarky means is a world with no trade. So if we live in this world with no trade, we are going to say that we have our countries again. So we have Saudi Arabia and the US. Then we have oil and corn. So we have all this going on. And we're just going to say, and again, this part, and I'm going to make a couple notes really quick as we go through. So this part we calculated from the initial, this part. So this first graph was given to us. Then we use that data to calculate the second graph. This third one is also going to be something that's given to us, right? So these are numbers that I have them prepared right here, but we just know what they are because we just know. So we're going to say that Saudi Arabia, if there was no trade, decides to produce 60 oil and 10 corn, while the United States decides to produce 20 oil and 60 corn. Then if we remember, and I'm just going to pull down really quick, we want to take another quick note of our opportunity cost. So for Saudi Arabia, right, it was 1 corn for 4 oil, or vice versa. And in the US, we had 2 oil, or 1 corn for, wrong way around. So Saudi Arabia can make would have to trade by themselves. If they want to make 1 unit of corn, they have to give up. Yeah, I had it right. My bad. So Saudi Arabia, if they want to make 1 unit of corn, they have to give up 4 units of oil. Whereas in the US, if we want to make 1 unit of corn, we have to give up only half a unit of oil. And on the other side, Saudi Arabia, so the other way we can think about this is Saudi Arabia can also get 1 oil for 0.25 corn, and the US can get 1 oil for 2 corn. Right, and these are the trades we're working with, and if we worked everything out, the points that we found here would get us to a point that works for us. But what we're interested in, let me find something really quick.